The rain had been falling over Seattle since dawn, turning the glass towers of downtown into blurred columns of silver. Inside the headquarters of Mercer Holdings, however, the weather was not what had Vanessa Cole irritated. "I cannot believe you actually expect me to interview her," Vanessa said, dropping a resume onto Grant Taylor's desk. "She is the last candidate today, and frankly, she is the least suitable person to represent this company." Grant, the director of human resources, looked through the half-open door toward the waiting area. A young woman sat alone beneath a large abstract painting. Her name was Caroline Reed. She was 26 years old. The left side of her face carried deep scars, and an uneven bone structure made one cheek sit higher than the other. A dark birthmark crossed part of her forehead. Thick glasses framed steady brown eyes. Nothing about her appearance resembled the polished executives featured in Mercer Holdings advertisements. But Grant had already read her resume. 2 university degrees with honors, business administration and finance, professional experience in international consulting, fluent in 4 languages, excellent references. "Mr. Mercer instructed us to interview everyone who met the requirements," Grant said. Vanessa folded her arms. "This is an executive assistant position. She would travel with him, attend investor dinners, meet clients. Image matters. Competence matters more." Vanessa laughed quietly. "You say that now. Wait until Adrienne Mercer sees her." Grant had heard enough. He walked into the reception area and offered Caroline his hand. "Miss Reed, Grant Taylor, thank you for coming." For the smallest fraction of a second, Caroline looked surprised. She was accustomed to people staring before remembering their manners. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity." Her handshake was firm. During the interview, Grant quickly discovered that the resume had understated her abilities. Caroline answered questions without hesitation, identified weaknesses in a hypothetical acquisition plan that several previous candidates had missed, and explained complicated financial concepts with remarkable clarity. When Grant challenged her in German, she replied fluently. When he switched briefly to French, she smiled and continued. Then he placed a difficult market report in front of her. Caroline studied it silently before pointing toward a column. "This projection assumes stable transportation costs. That assumption is dangerous. If fuel prices rise while the company remains dependent on a single shipping corridor, the margin disappears." Grant leaned back. She was easily the strongest candidate he had interviewed. Yet one uncomfortable question remained. "This position is unusually visible," he said. "You would accompany Mr. Mercer to conferences, dinners, negotiations, and international meetings. Does that concern you?" Caroline understood immediately. "You are asking whether I can tolerate people looking at my face." Grant felt embarrassed. "I could have phrased that better." "No, honesty is better." She folded her hands. "I was born with a facial condition, but most of the damage you see came from an automobile accident when I was 16. I learned long ago that people form opinions before I speak. I cannot control that." Her voice remained calm. "What I can control is whether their first opinion becomes their final opinion." Grant said nothing. Caroline continued. "I have spent 6 months looking for work. Employers praise my qualifications, then suddenly decide they need someone with a different presence. One manager offered me a position in a back office where clients would never see me." "And you refused?" "I did." "Why?" "Because hiding me would have confirmed the idea that there is something shameful about being seen." The answer remained with Grant long after Caroline left. That evening, he prepared his recommendations for Adrienne Mercer, the 45-year-old founder of Mercer Holdings. Adrienne had built the company from a small technology venture into a business empire spanning software, property development, investment, and medical research. Newspapers called him cold. Competitors called him ruthless. Employees simply called him demanding. Grant entered Adrienne's office carrying the candidate files. "Who is your first choice?" Adrienne asked. "Caroline Reed." He handed over her resume. Adrienne studied the photograph longer than Grant expected. "You know what this position requires." "I do. And you still rank her first. By a considerable margin." Grant prepared himself for an argument. Instead, Adrienne asked, "Why do people call me the calculator?" "Because you make decisions from evidence rather than emotion." Adrienne placed the resume on his desk. "Then why would I allow prejudice to become an exception?" Grant blinked. Adrienne looked again at Caroline's photograph. "If she is the most capable candidate, hire her. Without interviewing the others yourself? I hired you to judge talent. I would be foolish to ignore your judgment, because someone does not look like an advertisement." When Grant left, Vanessa was waiting. "Well?" "She starts tomorrow." Vanessa stared at him as if he had spoken another language. That night, across Lake Washington, Adrienne stood alone in his home, holding Caroline's resume. Beside him was an old photograph. Two identical young women smiled from it. One was Eleanor, Adrienne's late wife. The other was her twin sister, Irene. 15 years earlier, one terrible automobile accident had killed Eleanor and left Irene badly scarred. Eleanor had died that night. Irene had survived. Yet in Adrienne's mind, the accident had taken both women in different ways. Since then, Irene had barely left the Mercer family estate. Adrienne looked from Caroline's photograph to Irene's. For the first time in years, he wondered whether someone might reach Irene in a way he never could. Caroline arrived before sunrise on her first morning. Vanessa was already waiting. She led Caroline through the executive floor while explaining procedures in a tone that made every instruction sound like a warning. "Mr. Mercer expects perfection. His calendar changes constantly. His documents are confidential. His clients are among the most influential people in the country. I understand. And appearances matter here." Caroline stopped walking. Vanessa smiled. "I mean professional appearances, of course." Caroline knew exactly what she meant. Before she could answer, Adrienne's office door opened. "Miss Reed." His expression was unreadable. "Come in." Inside, Adrienne offered her a chair. He studied her without pity, and without the instinctive discomfort Caroline had learned to recognize. "I have a question," he said. "Your qualifications exceed this position. Why apply for it?" "Because I need employment." Adrienne almost smiled. "That is unusually direct." So was the question. Caroline explained the collapse of her previous consulting department after an acquisition and the months that followed. She had attended more than 20 interviews. Some companies rejected her politely. Others suggested positions away from customers. "One recruiter told me I should be realistic," Caroline said. "He said executive leadership requires a reassuring face." "And what did you tell him?" "That competence is usually more reassuring than symmetry." A brief silence followed. Then Adrienne asked something unexpected. "What happened when you were 16? Caroline looked toward the rain sliding down the windows. "My parents and I were driving home when another driver crossed into our lane. My parents died. I survived." She touched the edge of her cheek. Several surgeries followed. "I am sorry." "Thank you." Adrienne rose and walked toward the window. "My wife died in an accident 15 years ago." Caroline remained silent. "Her twin sister survived," he continued. "Irene was 52 last spring. Before the accident, she taught literature at a university. She traveled, lectured, argued about books, made friends everywhere. Afterward, she withdrew completely." Adrienne turned around. "She lives at our family estate outside the city. She rarely allows strangers to visit." Caroline began to understand. Is that why you hired me? No. His answer came immediately. I hired you because Grant said you were the best candidate. He paused. But your experience made me think of Irene. Adrienne explained that he had spent years encouraging his sister-in-law to return to teaching, writing, anything that might reconnect her with life. Nothing worked. I would never make this part of your employment, he said. But someday, if you were comfortable meeting her, I would appreciate it. Caroline considered his words. I cannot promise I can help. I know. People survive the same event differently. I know that too. But if she wishes to meet me, I will meet her. Something in Adrienne's face softened. Thank you. Then his tone became professional again. There is another matter. We are presenting Project Horizon to European investors this week. Read everything. He placed several thick folders before her. I want your assessment tomorrow. Caroline spent the day studying financial forecasts, technical plans, contracts, and expansion models. Before lunchtime, she noticed that one forecast assumed a regulatory approval that had not yet been secured. By late afternoon, she discovered that the proposed expansion underestimated regional operating costs. By evening, she had rewritten much of the risk analysis. Adrienne read her notes without speaking. Finally, he looked up. How long did this take you? Most of the day. Our strategy department has been preparing this for weeks. Caroline wondered whether she had overstepped. Was I supposed to limit my review? No. Adrienne turned another page. You were supposed to find weaknesses. He tapped her report. You found the ones everyone else missed. 2 evenings later, Caroline accompanied him to dinner with investors visiting from Germany. Several employees had predicted disaster. Instead, Caroline greeted the guests in fluent German and spent the evening discussing European financial regulations, pharmaceutical investment, and currency exposure. One investor, Kevin Bauer, shook Adrienne's hand afterward. Your assistant understands our market better than several consultants we hired. In the car returning downtown, Adrienne glanced toward Caroline. You surprised them. They expected less. They will not again. Caroline watched Seattle's lights moving across the wet windows. For years, she had believed every new room would require the same exhausting battle. Maybe she had been wrong about one thing. The battle never disappeared. But sometimes one person opening the door could change everything that happened after you entered. During Caroline's first weeks at Mercer Holdings, her work became increasingly difficult to ignore. She reorganized Adrienne's schedule, corrected errors in investment presentations, and created a briefing system that saved senior executives hours of preparation. She also became increasingly difficult for Vanessa to tolerate. Important messages mysteriously failed to reach Caroline. Meeting locations changed without notice. Documents disappeared from shared folders. Then came the rumors. Some employees whispered that Adrienne felt sorry for her. Others suggested Caroline had manipulated him with a tragic story. Caroline rarely responded. She had spent too many years learning that not every insult deserved the dignity of an answer. One Friday evening, Adrienne approached her desk. Are you available tomorrow? For work? In a sense. Caroline immediately understood. Irene? She agreed to meet you. The Mercer estate stood east of Seattle, among wooded hills overlooking the lake. When Caroline arrived, Margaret Ellis, the longtime housekeeper, welcomed her. Mrs. Irene almost changed her mind this morning, Margaret whispered. Please do not take it personally if she leaves suddenly. I will not. Adrienne waited in the library. Floor-to-ceiling shelves surrounded them, filled with rare editions and old manuscripts. These belong to Irene, he said. Before the accident, books were her entire world. A door opened upstairs. Caroline turned. Irene Mercer stood in the entrance. She wore a dark blue dress and a silk scarf, covering part of her face. The visible scars were extensive. But what Caroline noticed first were Irene's eyes. They were frightened, not of Caroline. Of being seen. Adrienne introduced them. Caroline extended her hand. "It is good to meet you." Irene hesitated, then accepted it. "You are not uncomfortable." Caroline smiled. "I was about to ask you the same thing." For the first time, Irene almost smiled. They moved to the terrace for tea. At first, they discussed harmless things: weather, books, Seattle traffic, Adrienne's inability to take vacations. Eventually, Irene looked directly at Caroline. "Adrienne told me about your accident." "Yes." "How old were you?" 16. "And your parents?" "They died." Irene lowered her eyes. "I am sorry." "So am I." The simplicity of the answer seemed to surprise her. "How did you recover?" Caroline considered the question. "I did not recover in the way people usually mean." Irene looked up. "For years I barely left home except for medical appointments. I covered mirrors. I stopped answering friends. I believed my old life had ended. Then what changed?" "A therapist named Evelyn." Caroline remembered the woman clearly. Evelyn had never told Caroline she was beautiful. She had never offered false comfort. Instead, she had asked a harder question. If you removed your face from the description of yourself, who would remain? At 16, Caroline had hated that question. Eventually, she began answering it. A daughter who missed her parents. A student who loved numbers. A woman with an unusual memory. Someone who learned languages quickly. Someone stubborn enough to survive. I began writing down one thing each day that I could offer the world that had nothing to do with appearance, Caroline told Irene. Did it help? Slowly, Irene touched the edge of her scarf. People still stare at you. Every day. And that does not hurt? Of course it hurts. Caroline leaned forward. Strength is not becoming impossible to hurt. It is deciding that pain does not get to make every decision. Irene became very still. For almost 2 hours, they talked. Irene confessed that after the accident she could not bear photographs of Eleanor. The twins had once been nearly indistinguishable. When Irene finally looked into a mirror after leaving the hospital, she felt she had lost not only her sister, but the identity they had shared. I was alive, Irene whispered, but the woman who survived did not look like either of us. Caroline understood more deeply than Adrienne ever could. Maybe surviving requires becoming someone new, she said. When Caroline prepared to leave, Irene surprised everyone. Would you come again? Yes. I have some medieval manuscripts you might find interesting. I know almost nothing about medieval literature. Then, Irene said, allowing a tiny smile, you clearly need my help. On the drive back, Adrienne was quiet. Finally, he said, she has not spoken that much to a stranger in 15 years. She is still there. What? The woman you remember. She is still there. Adrienne looked out the window. I know. But his voice revealed that after 15 years, he was finally beginning to believe it. Caroline began visiting Irene every weekend. At first, they discussed literature. Then business entered the conversation, almost accidentally. Caroline mentioned Project Horizon and described, without revealing confidential details, some of the challenges Mercer Holdings faced in research and development. Irene immediately asked questions. Not casual questions. Strategic ones. Within minutes, she identified connections between pharmaceutical research and emerging biotechnology markets that several executives had overlooked. The following Monday, Adrienne called Caroline into his office. Irene asked me for information about our research division. Caroline smiled. I wondered when she would. You expected this? I expected curiosity. I did not know where it would lead. Adrienne sat down. There is something you should know. Eleanor was not simply my wife. He opened an old company photograph. A much younger Adrienne stood beside Eleanor in a tiny office. She helped found Mercer Holdings. Caroline studied the picture. Almost nobody knows, Adrienne continued. Eleanor understood people and markets. I understood systems and technology. The company existed because our abilities fit together. And Irene? She had no interest in business. She preferred universities and manuscripts. He hesitated. But after Eleanor died, I occasionally discussed company problems with Irene. Her instincts were astonishingly similar. Adrienne explained that he once invited Irene to join the company. She refused. She believed everyone would compare her scarred face with Eleanor's. And so she stayed hidden. For 15 years. Adrienne pushed another folder across the desk. I want to restructure our research division. Would you ask Irene to consult with you? Officially? Only if she wants that. At first, she can work anonymously from home. Caroline agreed on one condition. Irene must be treated as a professional collaborator, not as therapy. Adrienne nodded. That is exactly what I want. Their work began cautiously. Caroline brought data to the estate. Irene studied it. Within weeks, the library became an improvised strategy room, covered with projections, market reports, and handwritten notes. Irene's mind seemed to awaken after a long winter. Margaret began noticing changes. Irene came downstairs earlier. She stopped covering every mirror. Then one afternoon she removed the silk scarf she usually wore while working with Caroline. Neither woman mentioned it. That silence mattered. Caroline did not stare. She did not congratulate Irene. She simply continued discussing the financial model. Later, Irene asked a personal question. Have you ever had a relationship since your accident? Caroline answered honestly. Yes. Was that difficult? Very. Irene waited. For a long time, Caroline continued, I assumed no man could genuinely want me. Then I learned that some people can see scars without making them the center of everything. How can you tell? By the way someone looks at you when they think you are not watching. Irene smiled sadly. Eleanor and I were identical. Men sometimes approached one of us thinking she was the other. And after the accident? No one approached me at all because I stopped giving anyone the chance. She looked toward the darkened window. I once saw Adrienne crying over Eleanor's photograph. When he noticed me, the expression on his face destroyed me. What expression? Grief. Irene swallowed. I convinced myself that looking at me reminded him of everything he had lost. That night, I decided nobody should have to look at me again. Caroline's chest tightened. You made a permanent decision, based on one moment of another person's grief. Irene looked at her. He was not rejecting you, Caroline said. He was mourning Eleanor. I know that now. But knowing something and believing it are different. Irene nodded. Weeks passed. Their restructuring proposal grew ambitious enough that Mercer Holdings board requested a presentation at the annual shareholder meeting. Caroline told Irene. To her surprise, Irene showed no fear. The proposal could significantly improve the company's value, she said. Of course they want to see it. We would work faster at headquarters. Irene stopped. There it was. The boundary. The estate had become safe. The office was not. I could continue from here. You could. Then why are you looking at me like that? Because I am wondering whether working from here is what you want or what your fear wants. Irene looked away. Caroline did not press further. That evening, as Caroline was leaving, Irene followed her all the way to the front door. Tomorrow, she said quietly, I want to see the office. Caroline felt joy rising inside her, but kept her voice calm. What time? Before everyone arrives. Then I will meet you there. For Irene, it sounded like a simple appointment. For Adrienne, when Caroline told him, it sounded like a miracle. For Caroline, it was neither. It was something more fragile and more important. It was one frightened woman deciding that fear would no longer be the only voice allowed to vote. Irene arrived at Mercer Holdings shortly after dawn. The building was nearly empty. Caroline met her in the underground entrance. Irene wore a scarf again. Her hands trembled. "We can leave," Caroline said. "No explanations needed." Irene shook her head. "If I leave before anyone sees me, I will spend another 15 years preparing to return." They entered the elevator. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Adrienne was waiting. He said nothing dramatic. No applause. No tears. "Good morning, Irene." She looked at him gratefully. "Good morning." They worked for several hours. Then employees began arriving. The first stranger who entered the conference room froze for half a second when he saw Irene. She noticed. Her breathing changed. Caroline continued presenting numbers. A second employee came in. Then, another. Some stared. Some looked away too quickly. Nothing terrible happened. By lunchtime, Irene seemed exhausted but steady. "I imagined this moment thousands of times," she admitted. Was reality worse? No. Better? Not exactly. Caroline smiled. That is often how fear loses power. Reality turns out to be merely ordinary. Over the following days, Irene returned. Not every day was easy. Once she overheard two employees discussing her scars near the elevators. She locked herself in a restroom and considered going home. Caroline found her there. "I cannot do this." "You can go home." Irene stared at her. "You are not going to tell me to be strong." "No." Caroline leaned against the wall. "But decide why you are leaving." Irene said nothing. "If you are tired, leave. If you need rest, leave. If you simply do not want to be here today, leave. Those are your choices. And if I leave because of them, then they made the choice for you." Irene wiped her eyes. "What did you do when this happened to you?" "At my first consulting job, I overheard two colleagues joke that I should work in the basement." "What did you do?" "I cried in my car." Irene looked surprised. "Then?" "I came back the next morning." "Did you confront them?" "No. I became better at my job than they were." Irene laughed despite herself. "That sounds slightly vindictive." It probably was. Irene returned to the conference room. From that day, something shifted. Employees who initially noticed her scars began noticing her ideas instead. Junior analysts sought her advice. Executives requested her review of proposals. One afternoon, a young analyst named Olivia Park remained after a meeting. "My mother stopped leaving home after surgery changed her face," Olivia told Irene. "I wish she could see you here." Irene did not know how to respond. Later, she told Caroline about it. "I spent years believing my face could only make people uncomfortable. And today, apparently it can also make someone hopeful." Their project continued gathering support. That success, however, threatened Ethan Vale, a senior executive responsible for one of the divisions Irene recommended reorganizing. The proposal would expose years of inefficient spending and remove much of Ethan's authority. At first, he attacked the numbers. When that failed, he attacked Irene. Anonymous messages began circulating among board members. They questioned whether a woman who had lived in isolation for so long was emotionally stable enough to influence major corporate decisions. Then altered photographs of Irene appeared in an internal email chain. Someone had exaggerated her scars. The message described her as Adrienne's damaged relative being used to gain sympathy. Caroline discovered Irene sitting alone in the library at headquarters after reading it. Her face had gone pale. "I was right," Irene whispered. "About what?" "The world is cruel." "Yes." Caroline's answer startled her. "I thought you would deny it." "I will never lie to you." Caroline sat beside her. "There are cruel people. There are shallow people. There are cowards who hurt others because they fear losing power." She pointed toward the laptop. "But you were wrong about something else." "What?" "You believed their cruelty meant you should disappear." Irene closed her eyes. "Maybe disappearing would be easier." "It would." Caroline waited. "But easier and better are not always the same thing." The board presentation was only days away. Ethan expected Irene to withdraw. Adrienne privately offered to postpone everything. Irene refused. "No." She removed the silk scarf from around her neck. "I have spent enough years allowing other people to decide where I am permitted to exist." She looked at Caroline. "We present as planned." The morning of the board presentation, Caroline arrived early and found Adrienne pacing inside his office. "I should stop this," he said. "Why?" "Because Ethan is targeting Irene to get to me." "He is targeting Irene because he is afraid of the project." Adrienne looked toward the conference room. "If she breaks under this pressure, then you will support her." "I have already failed her once." Caroline shook her head. "You did not cause her isolation. I allowed it. You respected her choices. I watched 15 years disappear." Caroline understood the guilt beneath his words. Adrienne had built companies because numbers could be controlled. People could not. Grief could not. "Do not turn Irene's recovery into your redemption," Caroline said gently. Adrienne looked at her sharply. "She is not coming back to the world to repair your past. She is coming back because she wants a future." For several seconds, Adrienne said nothing. Then he nodded. "You are right." The board members arrived late that morning. Some greeted Irene warmly. Others avoided looking directly at her. Ethan sat near the far end of the table, wearing the calm expression of a man who believed damage had already been done. Irene entered without a scarf. A murmur moved through the room. She placed her notes on the table but did not open them. "Before we discuss the restructuring proposal," she began, "I understand that several of you received messages concerning my history and appearance." Ethan shifted slightly. "I would rather address those matters openly than pretend they do not exist." Irene walked to the center of the room. "Yes, I was injured in the accident that killed my twin sister Eleanor. Yes, I spent 15 years largely withdrawn from public life." She paused. That withdrawal was not wisdom, it was fear. Nobody moved. "I became so afraid of being judged that I judged myself on behalf of everyone before they had the opportunity. I rejected invitations before anyone could reject me. I abandoned work before anyone could question my abilities." Caroline watched Adrienne lower his head. "For years, I called that self-protection. It was actually imprisonment." Irene looked around the room. "If you believe my history makes me incapable of contributing to this company, then judge my work. Ask difficult questions. Examine every projection. Reject the proposal if the evidence is weak." Then her voice hardened. "But do not confuse a scarred face with a damaged mind." The presentation began. For more than an hour, Irene explained the restructuring strategy. She discussed biotechnology investments, pharmaceutical partnerships, research spending, acquisition targets, and long-term market risks. Caroline supplemented her analysis with international financial data. When a board member challenged their projections, Irene answered with precise calculations. When another questioned regulatory exposure, she cited the relevant changes and explained their contingency plan. Eventually, even the skeptics stopped examining Irene and started examining their notes. Ethan attempted one final attack. These projections depend heavily on leadership stability. Given your limited recent corporate experience, why should shareholders trust your judgment? Irene did not flinch. They should not trust my judgment because of my family name. She moved closer to the table. They should trust whichever judgment survives scrutiny. She opened a folder. Your division has exceeded its research budget for 3 consecutive cycles, while producing fewer viable patents than any comparable division in the company. Ethan's face tightened. Irene continued calmly. If I am wrong, show me where. He could not. The restructuring plan was approved. Then Irene made an announcement even Adrienne had not expected. I intend to return formally to Mercer Holdings, if the board will have me, as Director of Innovation and Strategy. Silence. Then Grant began clapping. Others followed. Not everyone applauded enthusiastically, but that no longer mattered. Outside the room, Adrienne caught up with Caroline. You knew? No. Irene joined them. Adrienne stared at his sister-in-law. Eleanor would be proud. Tears appeared in Irene's eyes. For years I thought honoring Eleanor meant preserving the person I was when she died. Her voice trembled. Now I think honoring her means becoming someone she never had the chance to meet. Adrienne embraced her. Caroline stepped away, allowing them the moment. Through the windows, Seattle stretched beneath a pale afternoon sky. Cars moved. Ferries crossed the water. Thousands of strangers continued living ordinary lives. For Irene, ordinary life had once seemed impossible. Now it looked like freedom. 3 months later, the atmosphere at Mercer Holdings had changed in ways no financial report could measure. Irene officially became Director of Innovation and Strategy. Her first initiative redirected research funding toward medical technologies that could improve access to reconstructive care for accident survivors and children born with facial differences. She insisted the program be profitable enough to survive rather than depending on charity. Compassion without structure disappears when budgets tighten, she told Adrienne. He smiled. That sounds like Eleanor. No, Irene replied. It sounds like me. For Caroline, those words meant more than Irene realized. Caroline herself was promoted to Vice President of International Development. The position was not a reward for helping Irene. It existed because her negotiations with foreign investors and her work on the restructuring plan had generated measurable results. Grant delivered the promotion letter personally. When you walked into my office, he admitted, I thought hiring you would require courage. Caroline raised an eyebrow. And it required common sense. She laughed. That may be the better lesson. Vanessa had been transferred months earlier after Adrienne discovered the deliberate interference with Caroline's work. Her departure was handled quietly. Caroline had asked that she not be humiliated. Why? Grant asked. Because becoming cruel to someone who was cruel to me would not prove I won. Ethan's misconduct produced greater consequences. An internal investigation connected him to the manipulated photographs and anonymous messages. He resigned before the board completed disciplinary proceedings. Irene refused to celebrate. I gave fear 15 years of my life, she told Caroline. I will not give resentment another 15 minutes. The business press soon discovered Irene's return. At first, the coverage was exactly what she feared. Headlines emphasized the accident, her scars, her long isolation. Photographers waited outside Mercer headquarters hoping to capture dramatic images. One reporter asked whether Irene considered herself an inspiration to people with unfortunate appearances. Irene stared at him. I consider myself a business executive. The clip spread widely. Gradually, the coverage changed. Journalists began writing about her actual work. One national business magazine published a feature on Irene and Caroline after they spoke at an international investment conference. The photograph showed them standing beside each other beneath bright stage lights. Neither woman attempted to hide her scars. The article focused on corporate innovation, but its final paragraph described something the reporter had observed backstage. People who met Caroline and Irene for the first time often looked at their faces. People who spoke with them for several minutes stopped noticing. The morning the article appeared, Caroline found a small box on her desk. Inside was a silver butterfly brooch. A note from Irene accompanied it. A butterfly changes inside darkness before it can fly. We do not see the marks of that struggle on its wings, but the struggle remains part of what made the wings possible. Thank you for teaching me that scars are evidence of survival, not instructions for how small a life must become. Caroline pinned the butterfly to her jacket. She walked toward the window and studied her reflection. For many years, looking into a mirror had been an act of inventory. Scar, uneven cheek, birthmark, glasses. Every difference catalogued like damage after a storm. That morning, she noticed something else first. She looked capable. Her phone rang. Adrienne. There is someone downstairs I think you should meet. A client? A candidate. Caroline smiled. What position? Financial strategy. He hesitated. She graduated with honors. Excellent references. Apparently, she has been rejected repeatedly after interviews. Caroline already suspected the rest. She has a congenital facial difference, Adrienne said. Does she meet the qualifications? More than meets them. Then why are you calling me? Adrienne laughed quietly. Perhaps I wanted to hear you say that. Caroline headed toward the elevator. At reception, a young woman sat with both hands tightly gripping a folder. She looked terrified. Several people had already glanced at her and then looked away. Caroline remembered another lobby, another resume, another morning when one decision had changed everything. She approached the young woman and extended her hand. Hello, I am Caroline Reed. The candidate slowly stood. Madison Hayes. Thank you for coming, Madison. Madison glanced at Caroline's face. Then something unexpected happened. Her shoulders relaxed. Caroline understood why. For once, the person on the other side of the interview table looked like proof that the door could open. Years later, Caroline would remember Madison's interview more clearly than many negotiations involving millions of dollars. Madison was hired. Then came another candidate. Then another. Mercer Holdings eventually changed its recruitment policy, so interview panels received qualification summaries before photographs or video calls whenever a role allowed it. Grant called the idea simple. Irene called it overdue. Adrienne called it good mathematics. If appearance has no relationship to performance, he said during one executive meeting, then allowing appearance to influence the first stage of selection introduces useless noise into the decision. Caroline laughed. You really can turn fairness into an equation. I know my strengths. The company changed, but none of them pretended prejudice had vanished. Visitors still stared sometimes. A new employee once mistook Irene for a patient arriving for a meeting with the company's medical division. Caroline still encountered strangers whose expressions changed when they saw her. There were difficult mornings. There were photographs she disliked. There were evenings when old insecurities returned without invitation. Recovery, Caroline eventually understood, was not a bridge crossed once. It was a road traveled repeatedly. Irene learned the same lesson. Sometimes before large conferences, she still stood in front of her mirror and felt the old desire to cancel. On those mornings, she no longer asked whether she felt afraid. She asked whether fear had earned the authority to determine her schedule. Usually, the answer made her smile. Adrienne changed too. For years, he had believed strength meant remaining functional despite grief. He had buried himself in work after Eleanor's death and treated endurance as healing. Watching Irene rebuild her life taught him otherwise. A person could continue moving and still remain emotionally frozen. Healing required more than surviving days. It required allowing something new to matter. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, the three of them visited a quiet garden overlooking Lake Washington. Irene carried no scarf. Caroline wore the silver butterfly. Adrienne brought flowers. They sat together until evening. I used to believe the accident divided my life into before and after, Irene said. Doesn't it? Caroline asked. It does, but I made the mistake of assuming everything after had to be less. Adrienne looked toward the water. And now? Now I think different and lesser are not the same thing. That thought stayed with Caroline. As people grow older, life rarely leaves them untouched. Some scars remain on the skin where everyone can see them. Others are hidden beneath respectable clothes, successful careers, marriages, quiet homes, or practiced smiles. A person may lose health, someone they love, a dream they spent decades building, confidence they once took for granted, or simply the version of themselves they expected to remain forever. The temptation is to measure everything that comes afterward against what existed before and declare the remainder inadequate. But Caroline had learned that a changed life could still be a meaningful life. Irene had lost 15 years believing that being seen imperfectly was worse than not being seen at all. Caroline had spent years believing rejection was evidence that something about her needed to be hidden. Adrienne had mistaken control for peace. Each of them had eventually discovered the same truth from a different direction. Human worth does not decrease when life leaves marks on us. There will always be people who judge quickly. Some will mock what they do not understand. Some will mistake beauty for goodness, confidence for competence, wealth for wisdom, or scars for weakness. Growing older does not guarantee freedom from such people. What age can offer, if we allow experience to teach us, is the wisdom to stop placing our self-respect in their hands. Courage is rarely a grand moment witnessed by a room full of people. More often, it is Irene entering an elevator while afraid. It is Caroline returning to work after crying in her car. It is Grant deciding to interview the candidate everyone else had already dismissed. It is Adrienne learning that love sometimes means opening a door without deciding what another person must do after walking through it. And perhaps that is why one ordinary hiring decision changed so many lives. Someone chose to look twice. Someone else chose to stay. Then, when they finally had the power to open doors for others, they remembered what it had felt like to stand outside one. The most important thing they passed forward was not success, money, or position. It was the simple dignity of being seen as a whole human being.